I remember the lantern light most vividly, how it quivered upon the varnished ribs of half-finished furniture, making every curve resemble the hollowed bones of some long-forgotten creature. The workshop itself lay in disarray, though not with the careless disorder of a common tradesman. Rather, it bore the unmistakable mark of a mind arrested in the midst of precision. Tools of every conceivable iron shape hung upon the walls in ordered rows, each gleaming, each sharpened, each ready to carve beauty from the stubborn reluctance of wood. Yet their rightful master lay sprawled beside the central workbench, head turned away, cheek pressed to the timber as though he had simply paused to listen to the grain. The pool beneath him darkened the planks like spilled lacquer. It took only a moment for the metallic scent to reveal it as blood. Holmes was already there when I arrived, crouched low, gloved fingers lightly grazing the stained floorboards. A constable from Scotland Yard hovered nearby, whispering orders with that peculiar blend of self-importance and impotence commonly found at scenes where Holmes had taken command. The gas lamp above flickered intermittently, throwing the detective's profile into sharp relief. Hawk-like, intent, as though even the silence confessed its secrets to him. He did not look up as I approached. "Observe the angle of the blood trail, Watson," he murmured, voice scarcely louder than the rustle of shavings beneath his knees. "Our Carpenter did not fall where he died. He crawled or was dragged. There is a vast difference between the two." I could not help but feel a chill, not merely for the corpse at my feet, but for the peculiar stillness within the workshop, as though every chair, cabinet, and splintered scrap bore witness yet dared not speak. There was artistry here, not only in craft, but in death. Holmes tilted his head, listening to something only he perceived. "And someone else stood here," he said after a breath. "Someone who remained long enough to consider their handiwork." Although I had seen horrors enough in Afghanistan, there was something uniquely unnerving about blood spilled in a place dedicated to creation, not destruction. A workshop ought to echo with chisels, sandpaper, and measured strokes, not the final heartbeat of a silent artisan. To those of you who follow these accounts of ours, your interest in these peculiar happenings compels me to set aside hesitation and recount the case precisely as it unfolded. If such chronicles provide clarity, learning, or merely a glimpse into Holmes's singular methods, then I trust you shall remain with me as we peel back each layer of this mystery. What follows is the slow unraveling of a death carved with deliberate intent, and the revelations that haunted us long after the workshop was swept clean. The end did not come with a sudden revelation, but with a slow turning of pieces, until the picture, once half seen, stood wholly before us. The missing twin of the asymmetrical chair was located at last, not in some noble household as we had suspected, but in the modest rooms of the carpenter's apprentice, who had hidden it with a desperation born not of guilt alone, but of terrified loyalty. Within its framework, Holmes uncovered a final hiding place, and in it a document whose existence I dare not describe in more than the vaguest terms. It spoke, in formal legal language, of an arrangement that linked the disgraced emblem on our wooden tile to the household which had abandoned it, and to decisions whose consequences, if revealed, might still ripple through society. Our murderer, when at last confronted in the very workshop whose floor still wore the faint shadow of the carpenter's blood, turned out not to be a cloaked stranger or titled villain, but a figure we had passed more than once with no suspicion. Their motive, when laid bare, combined genuine terror with a terrible selfishness. In the quiet that followed their confession, Holmes stood among the tools and fragments of unfinished work and remarked that wood, once stained, never quite forgets the hand that marked it. The workshop was swept clean, the furniture dispersed, yet whenever I pass a joiner's shop now, I cannot help but think of secrets built into the grain, and of a silent man who died rather than carve one last refuge for another's shame. Having thus sketched the course along which the case would eventually run, I turn now to those first hours after we left the workshop on the night of the discovery, for it is there that the true beginning of our pursuit lies. When we quitted that narrow lane, the air of London had turned exceedingly cold. A faint mist clung close to the cobbles, not enough to obscure the lamps, but sufficient to give each halo of light a blurred, watchful aspect. Holmes walked beside me in silence, his coat drawn close, his hat pulled low, his profile set in that particular rigidity which I had learned to interpret as the sign of a mind moving with great speed. I ventured one or two observations upon the peculiar cruelty of murdering a man in the very sanctuary of his labor, but received only a grave nod in reply. It was clear that until some internal process of comparison and deduction had been completed, idle conversation would be wasted upon him. We reached Baker Street in this fashion, and it was only once we had removed our coats and taken our accustomed places by the fire that Holmes appeared to return to our modest sitting-room in spirit as well as body. He stretched his long limbs before the grate, steepled his fingers, and closed his eyes. For some minutes there was no sound save the ticking of the clock and the faint rumble of distant wheels in the street below. At length he spoke, not to me it seemed, but to some invisible tribunal before which he silently arraigned the facts. A man of established reputation, he began slowly, a craftsman in a trade that demands both patience and exactitude, found dead upon his own floor. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle sufficient to disarrange his tools or damage his work. Yet blood in abundance, and the clear indication that he did not die where he first received his wound. What does this suggest to you, Watson? That he knew his assailant, I replied after a moment, and perhaps admitted him willingly. A quarrel, a sudden blow, and then— Holmes opened his eyes and regarded me with a faint, tired smile. You have described precisely the narrative which will comfort Lestrade and his superiors, he said. Unhappily, the floor has told us another tale. Our man did not stagger blindly. He moved with curious purpose. The marks at the workbench, the faint scuff upon the lower shelf, the smear of blood upon the underside of the plank. These are not the traces of a dying man seeking help. They are the record of someone who, in his final moments, reached for something specific, or for some place. You believe he attempted to hide something? I asked. I believe, said Holmes, that he attempted to finish an action he had already begun. Whether that action was the concealment of an object or the alteration of a structure remains to be seen. But mark this, Watson. There was no sign of anything in that room having been hastily seized. The tools rested in their ordered places. The unfinished cabinet bore no fresh damage, yet there was a vacancy upon the bench where an object of some weight must recently have stood. It is often the empty space, rather than the crowded one, which demands our attention. There was something in his tone, a subtle sharpening that stirred my sense of anticipation. I rose, fetched paper and pen from the side table, and set myself to make a more detailed record of the room than my memory alone might later supply. I'd long since learned that Holmes valued such efforts not merely for their immediate utility, but for the discipline they imposed upon my own perceptions. You observed the widow, Holmes continued, as though following a thread visible only to him. What impression did she make upon you? A woman crushed by grief, said I. Her hands shook. Her voice scarcely rose above a whisper. She seemed more bewildered than angry. Holmes nodded slowly. Yet when Lestrade mentioned the possibility of thieves, her eyes did not widen. They closed. It was a brief thing, but decisive. She did not fear the loss of property, Watson. She feared the naming of a motive that would keep Scotland Yard within her life longer than she could endure. There is something she dreads more than poverty. Exposure, I suggested, thinking of small domestic scandals, debts, or the petty miseries of the poor. Perhaps, he replied, his gaze fixed now upon the faint reflection of the fire in the window, or the stirring up of embers she has spent years pressing down. We must not yet, Assume that the secret at the heart of this case belongs to the dead man alone. Those who live beside a craftsman of hidden spaces do not always remain untouched by his occupation. I confess that at this remark a slight chill passed over me, quite apart from the temperature of the room. The notion that one might dwell for years amid objects designed to conceal the burdens of other lives, without some part of that concealment seeping into one's own heart, struck me with unusual force. I said as much to Holmes, who rewarded the observation with a rare, approving glance. "You grow perceptive, my dear fellow," he said. "It is a habit one may safely cultivate in my company. Now, there is the matter of his muteness, of which the widow spoke as if it were a misfortune and nothing more. To lose one's voice in such a trade might appear to be a hindrance, yet I suspect it may have recommended him to certain patrons. A man who cannot speak is a man whose discretion is beyond mere promise." "You mean," I said, "that his very incapacity became a guarantee?" "Just so," Holmes answered. "Imagine, if you will, the kind of client who might seek not merely a locked drawer, but a piece of furniture whose compartments are known only to its maker. Such a client would value a craftsman who could not betray him even under the most determined questioning. Our carpenter's silence would then cease to be an affliction and become instead his most marketable attribute." This view of the situation was at once so simple and so striking that I marveled at not having thought of it myself. It cast the dead man in a different light, not as a humble artisan plodding through life, but as a figure moving quietly at the edges of more dangerous stories. "It follows," I said slowly, "that those who employed him may have had much to lose if his knowledge, such as it was, fell into other hands." "It follows," Holmes replied, "that somewhere among his clients there may be one who could not bear the thought of his silence ending. Death, Watson, is a peculiar kind of confession. It opens houses as well as hearts. The moment the body was discovered, the workshop ceased to be a private sanctuary and became instead a space accessible to policemen, coroners, and, alas for our unknown patron, consulting detectives." He rose then, as if the thought would not allow him to remain seated. Crossing to the mantelpiece, he took down the small card upon which Lestrade had scribbled the carpenter's particulars and held it between finger and thumb. "We must know," he said, "who crossed that threshold in the past year. Every commission, however humble, every delivery, every client, it is a tedious inquiry, but one upon which the entire structure may rest. Without it, we grope among shadows." "And Lestrade?" I asked. "Will he cooperate?" Holmes allowed himself a dry little laugh. "He will protest," he said. "He will complain of interference. He will point to thieves and doors with no broken locks. But he will not refuse, for the simple reason that Scotland Yard abhors loose threads. If I hint that this case may touch upon matters above his rank, he will permit much in return for a share of whatever credit may eventually attach to its solution." It was at that moment that Mrs. Hudson entered with the evening post upon a tray. There were 2 letters of no importance, a circular of medical instruments addressed to me, and a single telegram which she handed to Holmes with the air of one transferring something faintly distasteful. He tore it open with his long, nervous fingers, scanned the brief message, and passed it across to me without a word. "You found nothing." There was no signature, no indication of origin beyond the usual inked stamp of the office through which it had passed. The words stood alone, like a verdict. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. "This can hardly be coincidence," I murmured. "Someone who knows we visited the workshop. Someone who wishes to correct us," Holmes interposed quietly, "or to chide us. Notice the absence of triumph. It is not, 'You will find nothing.' It is, 'You found nothing.' A simple statement of fact and an assertion of superiority. Our correspondent believes himself ahead of us and wishes us to know it." "Then he was there," I said, "or has access to those with knowledge of our movements." Holmes turned the slip of paper over, as if some further clue might be written upon the reverse. Finding none, he laid it carefully upon the mantelpiece, weighting it with the stem of his pipe. "You may be sure, Watson," he said at last, "that when a man takes the trouble to announce our failure, he has already made his first mistake. Pride, even in shadowy pursuits, remains the cheapest of luxuries. Tomorrow we shall return to that workshop. This time we shall endeavor to see what he did not intend to be seen." With that, he drew his dressing gown about him, took down his violin from its familiar corner, and set the bow to the strings. The first low note vibrated through the room, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the faint murmur of the street outside. As the melody unfolded, melancholy, searching, I sat back in my chair and let the music weave itself around my unease. Somewhere in London, a man who had walked among sawdust and secrets lay upon his slab at the mortuary, while another, very much alive, watched to see whether two residents of Baker Street would dare to look again beneath the surface of his silence. The following morning broke with a pale, reluctant light that struggled through a thin veil of cloud, casting upon Baker Street a wan glow that seemed more reflective of our state of mind than of the hour itself. Holmes rose early, or rather, I should say, he ceased pretending to sleep. I'd heard the faint rustle of papers and the occasional creak of floorboards through the night, which told me he had passed the hours in that intense, silent labor of thought that often left him more fatigued than a full day's exertion. When I entered our sitting room, he stood already dressed, coat buttoned and hat in hand, his gaze fixed upon the telegraph slip from the previous evening. He did not look up until I had poured myself a cup of coffee. "London," he said, as though continuing a conversation already begun, "contains no shortage of men who believe themselves cleverer than the institutions that govern them. Our correspondent is one such man. It is to our advantage." I asked how he accounted for that, and Holmes replied that confidence breeds patterns. A cautious adversary conceals tracks. A proud one leaves them deliberately, believing them indistinguishable to lesser minds. His voice carried a quiet satisfaction, the sort that precedes not victory, but the scent of pursuit. We set out at once toward Fleet Street, Holmes striding with long, purposeful steps that forced me to shorten my own stride lest I fall behind. London had awakened in the meantime. Costermongers cried their wares. Newspaper boys darted between carriages. Gentlemen hurried with umbrellas tucked beneath their arms. Yet as we passed into narrower lanes where the city's tradesmen plied their subtler crafts, the noise fell away, replaced by the soft knocks of mallets, the metallic rasp of files, and the distinct resinous aroma of fresh-cut wood. Holmes inhaled it deeply. "It is a curious scent, Watson," he remarked, "one that mingles creation and destruction. A piece of timber must be wounded before it becomes useful." Our destination proved to be a warehouse, tucked discreetly between a printmaker's shop and a wine importer's office. Its sign bore no letters, only the carved silhouette of a plane and chisel, the wood polished so smooth that years of weather had barely touched it. Inside, the air was thick with varnish, turpentine, and oils from distant shores. Exotic woods lay stacked in careful rows, their surfaces gleaming like polished stone. Here was no common lumber yard, but a trove for artisans whose ambitions exceeded the limitations of English oak. A man with ink-stained cuffs and spectacles, perched precariously upon his nose, approached us, wiping his hands on an apron more suited to a chemist than a carpenter. He greeted Holmes with a caution that suggested respect tinged with apprehension. "You understand," he said in a hushed tone, "that we do not inquire into the purposes of our clients. We sell materials, nothing more." Holmes assured him that such discretion was neither questioned nor threatened. He then inquired after the silent carpenter by name. The merchant nodded, though his expression clouded. "He ordered rosewood," the man said. "Fine pieces, dense, dark, expensive, the kind used for decorative paneling in desks or cabinets destined for gentlemen's studies. I recall the shipment well, for he paid in full, and promptly. Yet I never saw the completed work. I assumed illness, or the patron withdrew. Holmes examined the merchant with narrowed eyes. No record of further purchases. No return, no complaint. None, he replied. But there was something odd. He requested pieces pre-cut to precise lengths uncommon in ordinary design, as if constructing a framework within a framework. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. The warehouse's dim light caught upon the rows of timber, casting long, solemn shadows. It felt in that moment less like a place of trade and more like a necropolis of trees awaiting rebirth into shapes that might conceal more than books or linens. When we stepped outside again, Holmes paused beneath the eaves, drawing his coat more tightly against a chill that had little to do with the weather. "You observed," he said, "that the merchant spoke not of furniture, but of paneling. He assumed the rosewood formed the outer beauty of the piece. But paneling, Watson, may just as readily compose the inner skeleton of a structure concealed from view. A beautiful thing within a beautiful thing." "You believe the rosewood was used?" I said, "but in a manner invisible even to the patron?" Holmes nodded. "Or removed before the final presentation. Our carpenter may have designed a dual commission, one for the client, another for himself." This speculation unsettled me more than any ghostly tale whispered over embers, for it spoke not of passion or revenge, but of a man whose hands built sanctuaries in layers, each with a different master in mind. A craftsman of secrets is a dangerous creature indeed, not merely to others, but to himself. By afternoon we found ourselves in a dim tavern where tradesmen gathered after labor. Whispered inquiries led Holmes to one who claimed to have known the silent man personally in earlier years. The fellow, burly and red-faced, spoke with the exaggerated candor of a man who has spent too long swallowing truths he dared not utter. "He had a way with compartments," the man said, lowering his voice. "Not drawers, mind you, compartments. Clever things. You'd swear a piece weighed no more nor less than it should, even if it held a secret within. Nobles came to him. Barristers. Once I saw a carriage with the royal livery outside his shop. Never knew who was inside." Holmes leaned forward. "You speak confidently. Were you involved in these commissions?" "Aye. Once. Long ago. Never again." The man's face paled, no small feat considering his ruddy complexion. He worked silent, always silent. Wrote his instructions, nodded, pointed. Never asked a question, never answered even if you begged him. But he knew what those pieces were for. You could see it in his eyes. "Fear?" I asked. "No," the man whispered. "Judgment." Holmes rose without finishing his drink. He pressed a coin onto the table, a gesture both courteous and final. Outside, the evening settled upon London like a shawl. Carriages rattled along slick stones. The sky deepened to a bruised violet. Holmes walked in silence, the set of his shoulders expressing a tension I had not seen since the most perilous days of the Baskerville affair. I ventured at last. "What troubles you?" "Patterns, Watson," he replied. "Patterns that do not align. Our carpenter crafted hiding places, yet died in a room where nothing lay hidden. He ordered rare wood, yet none of it appears among his completed work. Clients sought secrecy, yet none have stepped forth to inquire after their commissions. And now—" He stopped beneath a street lamp, withdrawing from his coat a small slip of parchment obtained from the warehouse's ledger. Upon it was written a single set of initials, C.H. "Whoever this individual may be," Holmes continued, "he placed a commission of such cost and precision that it drained nearly the carpenter's entire supply of rosewood. Yet no piece matching that description has surfaced. Not abandoned, not destroyed, not reclaimed. It has simply vanished." "What do you infer?" I asked. That there exists, Holmes said quietly. Somewhere in London, a piece of furniture whose very presence is a danger to those who know of it. A cabinet, perhaps, or a writing desk. Something built with the silent man's full genius. Something worth killing for. The street lamp flickered, casting a brief tremor of shadow across Holmes's face. I could not tell whether the cold that ran through me was born of the night air or the magnitude of the implications. We were nearing Baker Street when Holmes paused suddenly, his hand raised. From across the road, beneath the archway of a shuttered shop, stood a solitary figure cloaked in dark wool. Though the lamplight fell faintly upon him, his posture was unmistakably that of one who watches without wishing to be seen. His head inclined slightly, too slightly for a passer-by, too deliberately for coincidence. When Holmes took a step forward, the figure retreated into the blackness of the alley and vanished without sound. We reached our rooms with a heightened silence between us, each wary of lending voice to thoughts that might invite shadows into our very speech. Inside, Holmes took to pacing, I to writing. The fire burned low. The city outside settled into its nocturnal rumble. Hours later, as I finished setting down the account of our day, Holmes stopped before the window, staring out into the street with the stillness of a hunter at the edge of a field. "There is someone," he murmured, "who intends to see that we do not learn the purpose of that missing commission. And there may come a moment, Watson, when we must decide whether the truth is worth its eventual price." His violin remained untouched in its corner, and the night passed without music. The workshop had given us silence. London now returned it with interest. I had long known craftsmen of many sorts. Gunsmiths in Afghanistan whose hands shook from age, yet whose barrels fired straight as scripture. Cobblers in London alleys who could fashion boots to outlast war, and surgeons whose fingers trembled with emotion, though never with steel. Yet the silent carpenter possessed a peculiarity that placed him beyond mere skill. He labored not only with wood, but with the concealed architecture of men's fears. The more we learned of his muteness, the more unnatural the quiet of his workshop seemed, as if the absence of speech had been absorbed into the very grain of his trade. It was 2 days after our visit to Fleet Street when Holmes proposed we seek the physician who had tended the carpenter after his accident. The hour was late afternoon, and the sky hung low and swollen with the promise of rain. We crossed London by cab, Holmes insisting upon this rare indulgence due to the urgency of the inquiry, and arrived at a modest brick house on a street whose windows suggested lives of respectable dullness. The physician, a gentleman of small stature and large spectacles, welcomed us with a formality born of habit rather than warmth. He recognized me first, having read some of my medical writings, and only afterwards seemed to grasp that the tall, hawk-like figure beside me was the Sherlock Holmes. Holmes wasted no time in pleasantries. "You attended a certain Carpenter," he began, naming the man. "We wish to know the manner in which he lost his voice." The physician settled himself, folding his hands in the manner of lecturers about to begin exposition. "A chisel," he said, "a wickedly sharp instrument, slipped during a commission, pierced beneath the jaw and severed part of the vocal mechanism. He lived, of course, but the cords were ruined. The wound healed, though he never regained more than a rasping whisper." Holmes's eyes flickered. "And his temperament changed?" "To silence, certainly. Before the accident he spoke every thought, too freely perhaps. Afterwards he took to communicating by slate and pencil, or through nods and gestures. Remarkably patient. He became observant." Holmes leaned forward. "Observant in what sense?" "In the way of those who must gather information without speech," the physician replied. "He noticed details. He watched faces. He listened, though not with ears, I think. I sometimes believed he understood more than the one speaking." Holmes muttered something under his breath too soft for me to catch. the doctor continued, unaware of the significance gathering like storm clouds over Holmes's expression. There was another change, he said. He began taking commissions outside ordinary trade. Clients arrived at irregular hours. The sums he earned no longer reflected mere carpentry. Holmes rose abruptly. Did he confide in you? In writing, perhaps? The physician shook his head. No man kept his silence with greater conviction. We thanked him and departed. Outside, the first drops of rain had begun to patter upon the cobblestones. Holmes walked with unusual slowness, deep in thought. You perceive, Watson, he finally said, that the man's silence was not simply a matter of physical loss. It became currency. He traded speech for trust. The wealthy and cautious prefer a servant who cannot betray them. You suggest his muteness invited danger. I suggest, rather, Holmes said, that he entered a realm where speech itself would have been a liability. The man who knows how secrets are stored becomes a secret himself. At that moment, a carriage passed through a puddle beside us, splashing muddy water upon my boots. I muttered an oath, but Holmes appeared not to notice. His attention had fixed upon a lone figure standing beneath a closed bookstall awning, cloaked, motionless, watching us. Before I could turn more fully, the figure disappeared into the rain-soaked crowd. Back at Baker Street, Holmes disappeared into his room for nearly an hour, leaving me by the fire with my notes. When he emerged, his face held the strained pallor I recognized from cases that pressed upon his conscience as much as his intellect. I have been assembling a chronology, he said, producing several sheets covered in neat, angular handwriting. A carpenter gained his silence 6 years ago. Within 2 years, he began taking private commissions. Within 1 year of that, he ceased all ordinary trade. The final 18 months, these months are unaccounted for, save for cryptic transactions that suggest he worked almost exclusively for a single client. The commissioner whose initials were CH, I said. Holmes nodded. It is unclear whether CH was the patron who sought concealment or whether the carpenter hid something from him. Either is perilous. He paused, then continued in a tone I had seldom heard from him. Quiet, deliberate, touched faintly with apprehension. There is a difference, Watson, between a cabinet crafted to hide a jewel and a cabinet crafted to hide a life. He reached into his pocket and produced an object wrapped in cloth. When he unrolled it upon the table, I saw the faintly blood-stained wooden tile we had recovered from behind the workshop's tool rack. The sigil carved upon it resembled a crest, though partially damaged, as if scraped down by a knife. I have made inquiries, Holmes said. We shall visit a heraldry specialist this evening. We set out just past dusk. The rain had grown heavier, and the lamps cast long, trembling reflections upon the pavement. Our destination was a quiet building off Cavendish Square, where an elderly gentleman kept extensive records of armorial devices. He greeted Holmes with barely concealed irritation, but softened when Holmes revealed the tile. The old man studied it beneath a magnifying glass, turning it this way and that, squinting through rust-colored lenses. It was noble, he said at last. Not now. This design was abandoned. Struck from public record, not disgraced. Erased. For what reason? Holmes asked. The man hesitated. That I cannot say. But whatever scandal befell the family, it did not fade with time. Some secrets are not forgotten so much as buried beneath deeper ones. Holmes thanked him, and we departed. The rain had ceased, leaving the world slick and gleaming. Our footsteps echoed through the square. This is no longer, Watson, a question of how a man died, Holmes said. It is a question of what truth he died protecting. As we turned toward Baker Street, a horse-drawn brougham rolled to a halt beside us with unusual precision. The window lowered a fraction, just enough for a gloved hand to lower a folded paper onto the step before the carriage lurched away without waiting for acknowledgement. Holmes stooped to retrieve it. Beneath the gas lamp, we unfolded the message. No address. No signature. Only 2 lines. The chair has a twin. Leave it buried. Holmes's breath left him in a sharp exhalation. He still believes we are merely curious, he murmured. That error may yet prove fatal, to him or to us. We walked home in silence. The night felt too still, the street too narrow, as though London itself had drawn closer to listen. The case of the silent carpenter no longer concerned a workshop, or a craftsman, or even a murder. We had stepped, without fanfare, into the space between what men build and what they conceal. And somewhere, perhaps watching even now, was the one who feared that twin chair more than the gallows. I have often reflected upon how swiftly Baker Street can shed its identity as a domestic space and assume the character of a laboratory, an armory, or a battlefield. On that particular evening it became a workshop, not in imitation of the carpenter's domain, but as the dissection chamber of his life's work. The transformation began gradually. First a modest parcel containing brass hinges and handle plates, then a wagon from Scotland Yard bearing the unfinished cabinet and an assortment of smaller pieces. By nightfall, our sitting room bore scarcely a trace of its former comfort. Chiseled panels leaned against the bookshelves, drawers lay upon the hearthrug, and the ghostly scent of varnish crept into the very upholstery. Mrs. Hudson, upon witnessing the invasion, declared that she would pray for strength, then retreated downstairs with an expression that suggested she doubted heaven's ability to provide sufficient reserves. Holmes, for his part, seemed invigorated. While I attempted to rescue my medical journals from beneath a stack of carved moldings, he moved among the fragments with an energy bordering upon reverence, tapping lightly with his cane, pausing to run a finger along dovetailed joints, inspecting grain structure beneath a magnifying lens. "You remarked once," he said, without looking up, "that a man's profession leaves its mark upon his character. Consider the inverse, Watson. A man of hidden burdens creates hidden structures. The workshop was merely flesh. These pieces are the bones." He placed 2 panels side by side, their patterns so similar that I assumed they formed opposite sides of the same cabinet. Yet Holmes shook his head and repositioned them so that their patterns mirrored not symmetry, but continuity, like 2 halves of a torn map. "This is not ornament," he murmured. "It is instruction." I confess I saw nothing of the sort, though I have learned that Holmes's deductions often appear nonsensical until they resolve all at once into clarity. The patterns consisted of flowing arcs surrounding a central diamond, repeating across several pieces with slight variations. The work was fine and subtle, and though I admired the craftsmanship, I could not imagine what secret lay beneath the curve of a carved line. Holmes produced a thin piece of parchment bearing measurements copied from the carpenter's ledger. He placed a ruler across one panel, then another, tracing lines that corresponded to the ciphered figures. "Observe," he said, "the curves do not merely please the eye, they conceal angles. The arcs intersect at points equidistant across panels that were never meant to be adjacent. Only when reassembled in the correct order do they reveal the true geometry of the piece." "What geometry?" I asked, somewhat impatiently. "The geometry of concealment," Holmes replied. He arranged 4 panels in a square, then set atop them a flat plank bearing tiny holes drilled at irregular intervals. When he shone a lantern through those apertures, shadows fell across the carved designs in such a way that I could see faint internal lines, not carved, but implied, connecting across the panels to form a perfect rectangle hidden beneath stylistic flourish. Holmes leaned back with quiet triumph. A double structure, an inner case unseen from the exterior. A man might open every drawer of this cabinet and find nothing unusual, yet still stand inches from a compartment inaccessible without knowledge of this diagram. "And what was meant to reside in that compartment?" I asked. Holmes let the lantern's flame settle before answering. "Something worth killing for. Something worth silencing forever." He returned to work, examining each element with a meticulous care that left no groove untested. I assisted where I could, though my contributions consisted chiefly of handing him pieces and recording notes. The hours passed without our noticing. Dusk slipped into night, and the fire wore itself down to embers. At length, Holmes removed a narrow plank from the underside of the cabinet's frame. It bore a groove so shallow it seemed accidental, yet he handled it with the caution of a jeweler. Using a thin instrument akin to a surgical probe, he followed the groove along its length until, with a faint click, a concealed panel sprang upward. Beneath it lay a hollow recess lined with waxed canvas, the same material we had glimpsed in the workshop. Inside the recess lay fragments of parchment, curled and blackened by flame as if someone had attempted to destroy them in haste, but abandoned the act before completion. Holmes lifted them delicately, arranging them upon the table. The writing was faded, portions charred, but one detail remained unmistakable: the remnants of a wax seal, its insignia scraped away with fierce precision. Holmes stared at the ruined seal for a long while, his face expressionless save for the tightening of his jaw. I knew that look. It was not confusion, but recollection held in check. "You recognize it," I said softly. He did not deny it. "I have seen its like only once. I cannot speak of it. Not yet." I pressed him, but he silenced me with a raised hand. "When secrets intersect, Watson, it is sometimes wise to determine whose they are before proclaiming them aloud." Before we could examine the parchments further, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascended the staircase, accompanied by the murmur of a hesitant voice. A moment later she entered, announcing a visitor who refused to give his name. Holmes instructed she send him up. The man who entered appeared neither gentleman nor laborer. His coat was plain, his boots clean, his face forgettable save for the intensity of his eyes. He removed his hat respectfully, though his hands trembled. A detail not of fear, I suspected, but of fury barely restrained. "I have little time," he said, directing his words not to me but to Holmes. "You have found what you ought not." Holmes regarded him coolly. "You speak of the cabinet. Call it what you will," the man replied. "But leave it. Burn what you discovered tonight, return the pieces, and forget the carpenter. He died because he would not stop. Do not make his error." "And if we refuse?" Holmes asked. The man swallowed, his jaw twitching. "Then others will die. Perhaps you among them. I say this not as threat, but as certainty." I stepped forward, anger rising within me. "Who are you to dictate what course justice must take?" He met my gaze with hollow eyes. "A man who knows what silence is worth." Holmes studied him with renewed interest. "You knew the carpenter?" The man nodded once. "I owed him more than I can repay, yet I tell you this. The cabinet was never meant for its client. It was meant to keep something from him." Before I could question him further, he turned sharply toward the door. Holmes made no move to stop him. "Your warning," Holmes called after him, "came too late. The truth is already unwinding." The man hesitated with his hand on the doorknob. "Then pray you unravel it before he does." With that, he vanished down the stairs, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps and the heavy weight of unspoken implication. Holmes returned to the table and resumed arranging the charred fragments, though his movements had slowed. I sensed the night had shifted, that what had begun as a murder inquiry now teetered upon the edge of something larger, older, and infinitely more perilous. After a long silence, Holmes spoke. "There are men, Watson, who kill to obtain secrets, and men who kill to keep them hidden. We must determine which kind we face." I looked around the sitting room, transformed into an autopsy of the silent man's legacy. Panels, drawers, and fragments lay scattered like bones awaiting reassembly. Holmes extinguished the lamp save for a single, low flame. "Tonight we rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we begin not with the wood, but with the widow." He glanced once more at the hidden recess, now empty, its betrayal complete. The dead man built walls within walls. Now we must learn which were meant to imprison and which to protect. The fire dimmed. London outside settled into uneasy silence. Somewhere, across the city, a man watched the same darkness and wondered how long his secret would remain uncarved. Morning found Holmes in a state of activity so brisk that I suspected he had not slept at all. When I descended from my room, I discovered him already pacing before the fire, the cabinet fragments neatly stacked, the charred parchment arranged upon the table beneath a glass weight. Whatever doubts or unease had seized us the previous night had refined into a cold, precise resolve. "I have written to Lestrade," he said as I entered, "not because I believe he will be of assistance, but because his official hand may provide the authority we lack. The widow is unlikely to speak unless compelled, and compulsion from me alone would be improper." I asked whether we intended to call upon her immediately, but Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. The mind under grief must be read as carefully as any coded manuscript. A premature question may cause her to close like a shutter." His tone softened, though only slightly. "There is matter enough we may pursue without distressing her further." He gestured to the bloody wooden tile, still resting where he had left it. Its sigil, though damaged, seemed to glare through the grain like the faded crest of some ancestral shield. "We must learn whether the carpenter refused one commission or concealed another. And to do so, Watson, we must return to the place where he learned to carve secrets, not where he died using them." Thus it was determined that I should travel to the rural parish from which the silent man had fled years before. Holmes insisted upon my going alone, claiming the separation of our movements would be less conspicuous and that his presence was required in London for delicate inquiries of a political nature, a phrase which told me nothing yet implied much. I suspected, though he would not admit it, that he wished to test whether unscrupulous eyes tracked me as they tracked him. The journey was a long one, made beneath a grey sky that seemed perpetually on the brink of rain. The train rattled through fields and hedgerows, past cottages whose chimneys exhaled thin strands of smoke into the cold air. I carried with me only a small bag, a notebook, and Holmes's instruction to observe not merely answers, but evasions. The parish itself lay nestled among low hills and ancient oaks, its church spire rising like a solemn finger against the sky. Time moved differently there. The air bore the scent of wet stone and worn pews, and the people spoke slowly, as though words required careful weighing. I lodged at the inn, a humble establishment whose landlord eyed me with curiosity but asked no questions, a courtesy I appreciated more than I acknowledged. The next morning I called upon the vicar, an elderly man with a face lined by kindness rather than age. He remembered the carpenter as a youth of remarkable talent, quiet even before his injury, yet possessed of a watchfulness that unsettled parishioners unable to articulate why. When I asked about the rumors of hidden writings carved into the pews, the vicar hesitated, folding his hands atop his desk. "There was an incident," he said at last. "A foolish experiment undertaken by certain young people, your man among them. They believed confession could be made less terrifying if written rather than spoken. The pews bore tiny sliding panels, each containing scraps of paper on which parishioners could write their private sins." "And these writings were meant to be destroyed unread?" I asked. "That was the intention," he replied. "But man's curiosity is a persistent serpent. Whether they were read, I cannot say. But trouble followed soon after. A family left the parish. Another withdrew from society. A third—" He stopped, as though realizing he had said too much. "What became of the carpenter?" I pressed. "He left abruptly," the vicar replied. "Some said he was driven out. Others said he wished only to prevent further harm. I believe he carried the weight of those secrets with him, if that burden shaped his later life. I cannot be surprised." As I thanked the vicar and made ready to depart, he placed a hand upon my arm. "If you seek understanding," he said gravely, Forget the sins written on those papers. Seek instead the hands that removed them. His words lingered with me long after I left the church. I walked the length of the village before returning to the inn, observing those who passed me on the lane. Most spared me no more than a polite nod, but one man, a stable hand with broad shoulders and an impassive face, watched me too closely to be mere curiosity. When I met his stare, he turned abruptly and disappeared behind the lich gate of the churchyard. That night I slept lightly, waking more than once to the creak of floorboards below. The inn was old, and the sounds might easily have been its natural settling. Yet twice I rose, went to the window, and observed a solitary figure standing at the edge of the green, motionless beneath the dripping boughs of an elm. Whether he watched the inn or merely stood in contemplation, I could not say. Each time I lit my lamp, he vanished into darkness. The following morning I returned to London, my mind troubled by more questions than answers. When I reached Baker Street just after midday, I found Holmes bent over a collection of documents spread across the table. He looked up only briefly as I entered. "You have returned uninjured," he said. "Excellent. The countryside has a way of swallowing men who ask too many questions." I recounted my findings, including the vicar's words and the watchful figure outside the inn. Holmes listened with folded hands, his eyes half closed. "The man who watches without speaking," he said quietly, "is often the one who carries the heaviest guilt, not for attempts at concealment, but for knowledge he dare not reveal." He rose and moved to the window, gazing down at the street. "Your figure in the village and the one who visited us here. They are not the same man, but they share a burden. They obey not the murderer, but the secret itself." I expressed impatience with these abstractions, craving a more definite conclusion, but Holmes merely smiled. "You are a man of medicine, Watson. You seek diagnosis and cure. But this disease is not of the body. It is of the conscience. The symptoms hide the root." He returned to the table and retrieved a small item wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, I recognized the second telegram, the one delivered after the midnight visitor's warning. Holmes placed it beside the first. "You found nothing?" He said no. "Finish his work." Holmes tapped them with a forefinger. Two messages from different hands, yet both aimed toward the same goal, controlling the direction of our inquiry. One taunts, one pleads. Between them stands a truth neither party wishes revealed. I leaned closer. "Which side do we pursue?" "The side that fears us more," Holmes answered. "Fear reveals motive far sooner than pride." Before I could reply, a knock sounded below, urgent, unrefined, the sort that announces calamity rather than courtesy. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, breathless. "A man from Scotland Yard, sir, Inspector Lestrade. He insists upon seeing you at once." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "Let him in," he said. Lestrade entered, dripping from the rain, his expression taut with agitation. "Holmes," he said sharply, "there has been another death." Holmes's face hardened to marble. "Where?" Lestrade swallowed. "In the carpenter's workshop. His apprentice." For a moment the room seemed to constrict, as though all air had fled. Holmes took his coat from the stand. I followed without question. The silent carpenter had died alone. Now another had joined him. The grain of the wood, I thought, remembers every stroke. And someone, somewhere, feared what those memories might reveal. The journey back to the workshop seemed, in my recollection, both hurried and interminable. The cab rattled over uneven stones, sending up thin sprays of water from the gutters. The sky hung low and oppressive, as though London itself bent closer to hear the news Lestrade bore. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers tapping a silent rhythm upon his knee, the only sign of the storm within. Lestrade, wedged between us, smelled faintly of wet wool and impatience. He offered few details during that ride, either from lack of knowledge or from the stubborn habit of a man who prefers to reveal his hand upon his own stage, not in another's parlor on wheels. When we at last turned into the narrow lane, a knot of onlookers had already gathered, their faces pale smudges against the dimness. Uniformed constables held them at bay with an air of weary authority. The door to the workshop yawned open, a black rectangle against the yellow lamplight within. Holmes stepped out of the cab before it had fully halted and strode ahead, inclination of his head serving as our only invitation to follow. The scent reached me first, varnish, damp wood, and the sharp iron tang that needed no name. It was lighter than before, as if the room had already grown accustomed to the smell of blood. The apprentice lay near the same workbench where his master had fallen, though not in the same posture. His body hung at an unnatural angle from a coil of rope hastily affixed to a ceiling beam, boots barely brushing the floor. A crude stool lay tipped beside him, precisely where one would expect it in a scene contrived to suggest a certain conclusion. But the face, even in death, told another story. I have seen men who died by their own hand. There is a slackness to them, a terrible surrender. This youth wore an expression of startled protest, as though the world had betrayed him in his final instant. Lestrade cleared his throat with officious gravity. "Suicide," he said. "Overwhelmed by guilt, no doubt. Conscience is a weighty thing for a young fellow." Holmes made no answer. He moved beneath the dangling form with a care that bordered upon reverence, his eyes traveling from knot to beam to bruised flesh. He examined the boy's hands, the scuffed leather of his boots, the pressed-down fibers of the stool seat. Finally, he turned his gaze upon the smudged dust upon the floor, a dust that, to my unpracticed eye, bore no particular pattern at all. "Observe, Watson," he murmured at last. "Our young friend was right-handed. The ligature bears the mark of a left-handed knot. The stool shows pressure at its back edge, as though kicked, yet the dust lacks any trace of his heel. And here," he pointed to a faint line across the boy's right sleeve. "Fresh varnish, the kind used in this very room, yet still tacky. He brushed against something wet shortly before death, something which is not at present to be found." I drew closer, noting at once what Holmes indicated. The sleeve did indeed bear a streak of slightly glistening substance, too glossy and too recent to be ordinary grime. I glanced around the workshop. No open tins, no fresh strokes upon any visible piece. The air held only the residual scent of work long halted. Lestrade bristled. "Are you suggesting," he said, "that someone murdered the boy and hung him up like a side of beef for appearances?" Holmes straightened, his gaze meeting the inspector's with cool steadiness. "I suggest nothing, I observe. The body speaks its own language, Lestrade. It tells us he did not drag the stool beneath that beam unaided, nor tie so firm and practiced a knot as to hold his own weight, nor kick himself into eternity without marking the very dust that would grudgingly confirm your theory. If you call this suicide, then the floor calls you a liar." Lestrade flushed but said nothing. His jaw worked. His eyes flickered toward his men, as though weighing the consequences of argument. While they conferred in low voices, I took a moment to examine the apprentice's features. In life, he had possessed the fragile defiance of youth compelled to carry more than its rightful share of fear. In death, the defiance remained, though frozen and robbed of future. I recalled his earlier panic when Holmes had pressed him about the asymmetrical chair and its missing twin. Some knowledge had gnawed at him, some memory he dared not relay. Now that knowledge had been silenced in a manner chillingly appropriate to a case steeped in quiet. Holmes's attention, however, had turned away from the body. He paced the perimeter of the room, pausing at the workbench, the tool rack, the window. At the latter, he stopped, lifting a gloved hand to touch the inner frame. When he drew it back, the fingertip bore a faint smear of something darker than dust. Blood, he said. Not the boy's. Older. Dried. How can you be certain? I asked. The color, he replied, and the fact that it rests upon the very spot where the window latch would strike if flung sharply open. The master, I think, once stood here in haste, perhaps to admit a visitor, perhaps to cry for help he could not voice. He turned then to the workbench, running his hand along its scarred surface. The chalk marks we had seen before had been partially wiped away, yet a few remained, faint arcs and angles like the ghost of a plan half erased. Holmes studied them with narrowed eyes. The boy returned here, he said softly, more to himself than to us. He tried to read the language his master left behind, and someone watched him do it. The notion sent a shiver through me, despite the familiar creak of the floor and the ordinary tools lining the walls. The workshop, which once had seemed merely tragic, now felt maliciously alive, as if the wood itself resented intrusion. The silence pressed inward, heavier for the presence of two deaths where there had been one. As we stepped outside to afford the constable space to lower the body, a thin drizzle began to fall, more mist than rain, yet sufficient to blur the outlines of the onlookers. Their murmurs rose and fell like the tide. A woman crossed herself, a child craned for a better view until pulled back by an irritable hand. Life, indifferent to individual demise, flowed around us as steadily as ever. Holmes stood beneath the narrow overhang, his gaze fixed not upon the crowd, but upon a single dark doorway opposite. I followed his line of sight. There, just within the shadow of the entrance, stood a figure half concealed by gloom. I caught only the glimmer of eyes and the faint outline of a hat before the figure stepped backward and vanished into the interior. "The one who waited," Holmes said under his breath. "You believe it is the same man?" I asked. "I believe," he replied, "that our observer has grown bold enough to stand near his own handiwork, or fearful enough to cling to it." Lestrade rejoined us, looking more harried than before. "If this is murder," he said grudgingly, "then we have a devil on our hands. But I'll be hanged if I can see why anyone would dispatch the boy. He knew nothing by his own account." Holmes's lip curled slightly. On the contrary, he knew precisely enough to be dangerous. Ignorance is seldom a motive for elimination, Lestrade. Partial knowledge is. "In that case," the inspector retorted, "we are all in danger, are we not?" Holmes's answer was grave. "Yes." The word hung between us, heavier than the damp air. We returned to Baker Street in a silence of our own. When at last we shed our coats and took our accustomed places, the room looked altered, though nothing physical had changed. The fragments of the cabinet loomed like mute accusers. The charred parchment seemed cherier, the scraped seal more viciously erased. Holmes went to the mantelpiece and, without hesitation, lit the fire anew, feeding it until it blazed high. "You are not about to burn the evidence," I exclaimed. "On the contrary," he answered, "I wish for a moment to see it clearly." He held the scraps in the firelight, turning them so that faint inked lines glimmered where before they had been dull. Names remained illegible, but the shape of legal phrases could be discerned, a covenant here, a clause there, the skeleton of some binding arrangement. "Look, Watson," he said quietly. "This was no private letter. It was an instrument, something drafted to formalize secrecy, not to reveal it. Our Carpenter knew its contents, or suspected them. He destroyed it incompletely. A man interrupted, perhaps, or unwilling to commit himself entirely to the flame." "And the boy?" I whispered. "What did he read in his master's chalked symbols that cost him his life?" Holmes set the fragments aside and regarded me with an expression I'd come to dread, that blend of sympathy and hard necessity, which meant he was about to involve me more deeply than I might wish. "The answer to that question, my dear Watson," he said, "lies not in any workshop or parish, but in a drawing-room where no dust is permitted to settle. There is a patron, a person of standing, who commissioned a cabinet that never came to be. We have followed the trail of those who build. Now we must turn to those who command." He crossed to the desk and took up his pen. "I shall send a note," he continued, "to a certain solicitor who specializes in matters of inheritance and scandal. If my suspicion is correct, his hands will tremble when he sees the trace of this seal, even in its ruined state, and when hands tremble, tongues follow." As he wrote, the rain intensified, drumming upon the window panes like impatient fingers. I found myself staring at the bloody tile once more, feeling in its small weight the mass of 2 extinguished lives. "Holmes," I said quietly, "do you ever fear that our pursuit invites tragedy into the very rooms we seek to protect?" He paused, the pen poised above the paper. "Fear, Watson," he replied, "is an excellent servant, but a terrible master. I listen to it, I do not obey it. The tragedy was invited long ago, when the first secret was carved into wood instead of spoken aloud. We are merely the late guests at a banquet long since poisoned." He finished the note, sealed it, and rang for Mrs. Hudson to dispatch it at once. Outside, the city seemed to lean nearer, as if eavesdropping upon our intentions. Somewhere beyond the rain and the gas lamps, a man who had waited in shadows now knew that we would not, under any circumstances, leave his secret buried. Holmes dispatched the letter just after noon, entrusting it to a messenger rather than the post. He watched the boy disappear down Baker Street with an expression half distant, as though following not the youth's footsteps, but the string of consequences trailing behind them. When he finally turned from the window, the intensity of his gaze suggested that the note had not merely summoned information, but set a kind of trap. I knew better than to ask outright. Holmes rarely revealed the full extent of his strategy until the moment of its fruition. Instead, I occupied myself with straightening the chaos that had overtaken our lodgings, repositioning panels and drawers so that our carpet might once again resemble something other than the warehouse floor of a clandestine carpenter. The hours that followed stretched with a solemn quiet. Holmes resumed his study of the charred parchment fragments, occasionally muttering as he reconstructed phrases in his mind. More than once I caught him whispering legal language beneath his breath, words such as custodial authority and extrajudicial stewardship, terms usually reserved for affairs not meant for public record. He did not glance at me as he murmured, and I felt a growing unease, as though we trespassed upon matters that asked not merely to be concealed, but buried alive. Late afternoon brought a sharp rapping at the downstairs door. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson ascended with a calling card placed upon a small silver tray. I glanced at it, Mr. Percival Armitage, solicitor, the name written in a restrained, elegant hand. Holmes rose without haste, but with unmistakable purpose. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," he said. The man who entered possessed the discreet dignity of one accustomed to moving among powerful circles while avoiding the spotlight they cast. His attire was immaculate, his hair pomaded with surgical precision, and his manner that of a man whose profession required fluency and discretion. Yet despite his composure, his eyes darted about our chaotic room with thinly veiled alarm. "Mr. Holmes," he began, removing his gloves with a series of precise motions, "your note was of such urgency that I set aside a matter of considerable importance to attend you. I trust your business is equally grave." "That remains to be determined," Holmes said, motioning to a chair. "We require insight into a matter touching upon both heraldry and legal obligation." At the word heraldry, Armitage stiffened. At obligation, he paled. Holmes placed the blood-stained wooden tile upon the table between them, rotating it so that the damaged sigil caught the lamplight. The solicitor did not speak. His breath caught audibly, as though words had abandoned him. "You recognize this," Holmes said. "I recognize what it once was," Armitage replied, voice barely above a whisper. "That crest no longer exists. It was struck from record by decree." And such erasure, Holmes observed, is seldom accomplished without extraordinary cause. Armitage removed his spectacles and pressed a handkerchief to his brow. "You pursue dangerous inquiries, Mr. Holmes." Holmes leaned forward. "On the contrary, I pursue straightforward truth. Danger merely shadows it." The solicitor's composure cracked. "If that sigil has resurfaced, if any trace remains, then I implore you, destroy it. You cannot know what you risk." Holmes regarded him silently, unmoved. At length the man drew a trembling breath. "Very well. I shall tell you what I may, though not all. The family that bore that crest once held significant parliamentary influence. A scandal arose, long buried yet never forgiven, that involved a document of binding legal force. If revealed, it would have altered inheritances, titles, and the disposition of certain estates. It would have," he faltered, "it would have changed history." "And this document," Holmes said, "is the very one our Carpenter was asked to conceal." Armitage hesitated. "Not conceal, protect. There is a difference. Concealment implies shame, protection implies fear." "And who sought such protection?" I asked. A long silence followed. Finally, Armitage answered, "Not the family itself. Someone opposed to them, someone who believed the truth must remain dormant, not to preserve power, but to prevent ruin." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then the Carpenter did not serve one master, but stood between two." Armitage rose abruptly, as though the act of sitting had become unbearable. "If you value your lives, do not speak of this matter again. The workshop was merely the first grave, the boy the second. Do not fashion a third." Without awaiting dismissal, he fled down the stairs. Holmes watched him go, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You observed," he said quietly to me, "that he spoke not with guilt, but with dread. Someone has convinced this man that silence is noble. That is the most dangerous persuasion of all, for it lends righteousness to fear." He turned to the window as evening crept across the rooftops. "Watson, we must revisit the workshop tonight." I frowned. "To what end?" "The constables have taken what evidence remains." Holmes shook his head. "They have taken what they believe to be evidence. There is a difference. Something was newly varnished before the apprentice died. Something removed. Something that the murderer needed to access before the boy could understand its meaning. And we shall discover it in darkness." "We must see the room as the murderer saw it," Holmes replied. "In daylight, the workshop is a place of labor. At night, it becomes a sanctuary, or a confessional." Night had fully descended by the time we reached the narrow lane once more. The street was deserted, save for a single lamplighter finishing his duty at the far corner. Holmes produced a key. How he had obtained it he did not trouble to explain, and unlocked the workshop door. We slipped inside, closing it behind us. The silence pressed close, thicker now that no constables nor curious onlookers thronged its threshold. The lamplight threw long, malformed shadows upon the walls, making the tools appear like solemn watchers in a council of wood and steel. Holmes moved with a stillness that belied his restless mind, holding the lantern low to catch faint reflections along the floor. "Note here," he whispered. He knelt and brushed his fingers along a slight irregularity upon the boards. When I bent beside him, I saw only a faint seam, narrower than a fingernail. Holmes retrieved a thin blade and pressed it delicately along the seam. With a soft, reluctant sigh, a section of the floor rose, revealing a concealed compartment scarcely large enough to hold a folded sheet of paper. It was empty. Holmes stared at the hollow with an expression I could not immediately read. Not disappointment, but confirmation. "He returned," Holmes murmured, "after the master's death. After ours. The murderer returned to finish what he began. He knew precisely where to look. And what once lay there?" "Something the apprentice recognized," Holmes replied. Something he sought to interpret? Something worth killing twice for. He turned away from the hollow space and lifted the lantern higher, eyes scanning the walls as though waiting for them to answer. The room remained mute. At last he spoke, his voice scarcely more than breath. The carpenter refused to build a cabinet for the document. He instead concealed its trace. His apprentice discovered the trace. The murderer either wanted the document or wished to ensure no one ever did. "And now?" I asked. Holmes closed the compartment and rose to his full height. "Now," he said, "we must find not what was hidden, but why it was erased. A man who kills to destroy evidence is more ruthless than one who kills to obtain it. He's already defeated by the truth he fears." We stepped back into the night, closing the workshop behind us. The mist had thickened. Lanterns shimmered like floating suns along the street. Holmes drew his coat close, though not from the cold. "This war, Watson," he said, "is not between two men, nor even between two houses. It is between memory and oblivion." He paused, gazing down the street where darkness swallowed perspective. "And men who side with oblivion seldom stop at two graves." We walked home without further speech. The city seemed to listen. The secret seemed to breathe. And somewhere, beyond the reach of lamplight, I felt certain that footsteps followed. The fog that night did not roll through the streets as one sees in melodramatic illustrations. Rather, it pooled close to the ground, clinging to the wheels of hansom cabs and turning lamplight to soft halos. Baker Street had settled into its customary hush, save for the distant clatter of hoofbeats and the metallic sigh of passing omnibuses. Holmes did not speak upon our return, nor did he immediately retreat to his chemical table or violin. Instead, he seated himself at the edge of the settee, his posture fixed, hands clasped before him like a man contemplating a chessboard whose pieces have begun to move by unseen hands. I allowed him his silence, familiar enough with his habits to know that interruption would be wasted. I busied myself with the fire, adding coal until the flames cast the room in a warm amber glow. Only when the last ember settled did Holmes stir, his gaze lifting from thought into speech. "There exists somewhere in this city," he said quietly, "a piece of furniture never completed, a cabinet whose design depended upon layers of deception so intricate that even its absence casts a shadow. We must locate it, though it may not exist in physical form." I frowned. "How does one locate a thing that does not exist?" "One does not," Holmes replied, rising. "One locates the vacancy it left behind." He crossed to the corner where the fragments of the unfinished cabinet lay in careful stacks. Each panel seemed harmless upon first glance, mere joinery awaiting glue and polish. Yet as Holmes shifted them into new formations, I recognized in the angles a peculiar balance, as though the structure, if finished, would hold its secrets not by weight but by equilibrium. When he placed what I had assumed to be a decorative support alongside the central panel, a hollow corridor revealed itself, invisible when any single piece stood alone. "You see, Watson," he said, "the man built not compartments but pathways. Spaces between spaces. Each layer masked the next. To complete such a piece would require absolute trust between maker and patron. And trust, I think, was the one commodity the carpenter refused to grant." I ran a hand across the smooth grain of a panel. "He designed the hiding place, yet withheld the key." Holmes nodded, which meant either that he feared the patron or that he sought to protect that patron from himself. In either case, he died before the secret could be resolved. His voice took on a distant softness, as though he conversed not with me, but with the ghost of the man who had shaped the wood at our feet. "There is tragedy in unfinished work, Watson. Not in what remains unmade, but in what remains unread." Before I could answer, footsteps sounded upon the stairs. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the threshold, letter in hand. "This was delivered by special messenger, sir," she said, Her voice lowered as though she sensed the gravity of the evening. No return address. Holmes accepted the envelope, turning it beneath the light. The seal bore no crest, no initials, only a faint smudge of wax scraped by fingernails, as though whoever sent it could not bear the thought of leaving a mark. He opened it. The paper crackled. The message inside contained but a single line. He built it once before. Holmes read the words twice, then handed the slip to me. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You believe the cabinet was a second attempt?" I asked. Holmes paced toward the window. "No tradesman produces a masterpiece without practice. If this design was meant to conceal something, especially of political weight, then our carpenter would have tested the concept long before accepting a commission of such scale. A prototype must exist." "And where would such a prototype be?" I asked. "Not in London," Holmes replied. "Not when he worked in silence. It would be somewhere from before the accident robbed him of speech." "The parish," I murmured. Holmes nodded. The silent years began there. This revelation seemed to depress him into thought, though not for long. Within minutes he had donned his coat and searched the map drawer beneath his escritoire. "We travel tonight," he said. "A fresh set of eyes at the church may reveal what memory overlooks." Despite the lateness, we secured a carriage to the station and boarded the first night train heading northwest. The compartment was nearly empty. Only a half-drunk clergyman dozed beneath the window, his hat tipped over his brow. Holmes sat upright, fingers steepled, the rhythmic clatter of wheels matching the tempo of his deductions. I watched him in silence until the countryside swallowed all view beyond the glass. "Holmes," I said at last, "do you believe we pursue justice or merely conspiracy?" He did not look away from the darkened window. "We pursue truth. Justice and conspiracy are merely the shadows it casts, depending upon the angle of the light." Despite the humid warmth of the compartment, a shiver passed through me. We arrived at the village just before dawn. The churchyard lay silent beneath a pale horizon, headstones washed in faint silver. Holmes led me not to the pews, as on our previous visit, but to the vestry. He examined shelves of dusty hymnals, stacks of unused candle stubs, a battered collection of offertory plates. None seemed relevant. Then his eyes fixed upon a plain wooden chest tucked beneath a work table. It bore no lock, no markings. Holmes knelt and ran his fingers along its grain. "Do you see?" he whispered. Before I could reply, he lifted the chest's lid. Inside lay only scraps of broken wood and rusted hardware, detritus not worth keeping. But Holmes reached beneath the fragments and pressed the base. A soft thud sounded. He removed the pieces and tapped along the bottom. It sprang upward, revealing a false layer beneath. Within lay the remains of a small cabinet, shattered, stripped of its hinges, its compartments pried open by crude tools. The wood had been splintered in rage, not decay. Its corridors, though mangled, bore the same geometry as the fragments now stored in Baker Street. The prototype. Holmes exhaled slowly. "He destroyed it himself," I murmured. "No," Holmes replied. "This was not the hand of the craftsman. This was the hand of someone who feared what he had built." He touched one jagged edge, tracing a splintered groove. And he was not alone. "Look, blood, dried deep in the grain. Someone bled here." My heart clenched. The vicar's words returned. "Seek the hands that removed them." "And the boy?" I asked, barely audible. "Did he know of this?" Holmes's expression grew grave. He suspected, enough to become dangerous. The light strengthened across the churchyard, the first true rays of morning spilling over the stones. Holmes closed the chest and stood. "We leave this place," he said. "The village hides ghosts, but London hides the living. If the prototype was destroyed here, then the question is not what the carpenter built, but who demanded he never build it again. He turned to me, his voice low, and that man has now killed twice to preserve the absence of an object that never existed. As we walked from the church, the wind stirred the trees with a faint, sighing rustle, like breath drawn through a sealed compartment. We boarded the next train for London without breakfast, and Holmes sat in silence the entire journey, not in exhaustion, but in sharpening resolve. Whatever secret the cabinet held, its shadow had already claimed the living, and we had only just begun to open its doors. The return to London felt like re-entering a theatre moments before a play resumes. The streets bustled with the indifference of crowds, unaware that the quiet trade of secrets might shape the fates of men whose names they shouted in newspapers. Holmes said little as we left the station. Indeed, he seemed to fold inward, thoughts tightening like a noose around an idea not yet fully formed. When at last we reached Baker Street, he sat directly at his desk and drew toward him the blood-stained tile, the charred parchment fragments, and the notes I had made from our parish visit. He arranged them not chronologically, but as if composing a map, one whose roads did not appear on paper but in silence. "Watson," he said after a long interval, "there is a figure at the center of this web, a patron whose intentions remain hidden. We know his influence is sufficient to strike a crest from record, silence a craftsman, and command both allegiance and fear. It is time we look upon him plainly." I settled into my chair. "Yet we do not know his name." "We know what he has erased," Holmes replied, "and from the shadow of an absence one may often reconstruct the object itself." He stood and paced to the window, tapping lightly upon the glass with one finger. Outside, fog drifted between the lamps like pale drapery. "The erased sigil," he continued, "belongs to a house once prominent in legal matters and deeply enmeshed in Parliament. The document, whatever its nature, would have altered inheritance and power, not for the sake of exposing misdeeds, but to prevent upheaval. The Carpenter's first commission was a prototype destroyed by force. His second would have completed what someone feared most. Not revelation, but permanence." "And his refusal?" I asked. Holmes turned to me with an expression that held a strange mixture of admiration and sorrow. He refused to build a prison for a truth he dared not utter. He was mute, yet more vocal than those who speak. Before I could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with another envelope, this one sealed in plain red wax, unmarked. Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the note. His eyes narrowed. It read, "If you seek the patron, attend the auction at Spencer's rooms at 8. Do not bid. Do not speak. Do not approach him. He will reveal himself only to absence." There was no signature. Holmes rose instantly. "Fetch your coat, Watson." "But what is being auctioned?" I asked. Holmes slipped the note into his pocket. A relic of the cabinet, or a lure. Either would serve his purpose. We departed into the evening, the air sharp with the kind of cold that bites rather than chills. Carriages rolled past in swift procession, their wheels hissing through damp streets. By the time we reached Spencer's rooms, a crowd had gathered. Gentlemen in tailored coats, ladies in subtle jewels, and the peculiar breed of men whose fortunes originate from sources seldom named aloud. A footman accepted our cards and ushered us into the hall. The room was ablaze with chandeliers, their crystals scattering light across gilt moldings and deep velvet drapery. The attendees spoke in undertones, yet their whispers carried the unmistakable hum of scandal. Beneath the raised platform, items awaited auction beneath glass domes or velvet cloths. Rare books, antiquities, personal letters of statesmen long dead. Yet one item, placed apart from the others, drew Holmes's eye at once. A wooden panel, unpolished, its grain dark and familiar. Holmes's breath tightened. "A piece of the prototype," he murmured. I moved closer, careful not to draw attention. The panel bore subtle carvings, arcs and angles that to the unwary eye resembled decorative flourish, but to us they were unmistakable. Fragments of the hidden geometry that had defined both death and secrecy. Holmes did not touch it. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, eyes narrowed, observing not the panel but those who observed it. "Look, Watson," he said quietly. "Not at the object, but at the gaze that cannot leave it." I followed his meaning and surveyed the crowd. The panel drew attention from many, but one gentleman stood apart. Tall, immaculately dressed, face clean-shaven, posture erect with military bearing. His expression was composed, yet his right hand gripped the arm of his chair with such force the knuckles blanched. Holmes inclined his head toward him so faintly I might have missed it. "There is our man." "He does not appear a criminal," I whispered. "No," Holmes replied. "He appears a man accustomed to command." The auction began. Items were purchased with polite applause, bids exchanged with genteel subtlety. When at last the Carpenter's panel was presented, the room fell into a hush of expectant curiosity. The auctioneer announced it simply as a fragment of exceptional craftsmanship, provenance undisclosed. Several hands rose, art collectors, antiquarians, dealers of rare furniture. But the tall gentleman did not raise his hand. He watched with a rigidity that betrayed torment, not interest. Then, without warning, he stood and walked toward the exit. Holmes seized the moment. "Follow him. Do not let him see you follow me." I obeyed, slipping through the crowd and out into the corridor. The man strode with purpose, descending the stairs and stepping into the cool night air. I kept a discreet distance, blending with couples departing early. The street beyond was lined with carriages, horses stamped impatiently, steam rising from their nostrils. The man paused at the curb, turning up his collar. Holmes emerged moments later from another door, silent as smoke. We watched together as the man raised his hand, not to summon a coach, but to press a folded envelope into the hand of a cloaked figure who had materialized from the shadows. The exchange was swift. The cloaked figure vanished between pillars, and the gentleman stepped into a waiting carriage, which rolled away without waiting for direction. Holmes exhaled slowly. "That man is not the patron," he said. "He is the instrument. The patron does not attend his own stage." We moved toward the side street where the cloaked figure had gone. The passageway was narrow, brick-lined, lamplit only at one end. Holmes quickened his pace, and I followed close behind. Halfway down the alley, we found a small folded object upon the ground. Holmes retrieved it with gloved fingers. It was the very envelope the gentleman had passed, unsealed. Inside lay a single strip of paper, its surface bearing an imprint in dried brown wax, a scrap of the erased crest, preserved before destruction. Holmes studied it with a breath that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Not proof," he whispered. "Evidence." Rain began to fall, not in sheets, but in soft, persistent droplets that blurred the lamplight. Holmes tucked the scrap into his coat. "We have seen enough for one night," he said. "We return home." As we walked, he spoke only once more, voice low. "The true patron fears exposure so profoundly that he hides behind men who hide behind others. This case is not the pursuit of a murderer, Watson. It is the pursuit of a conscience." The rain thickened, the streets emptied. Our steps echoed like chisels against stone. And somewhere, in a house that bore no crest, a man waited for dawn, unaware that the silence he bought with blood was beginning to splinter. London, in the hours after midnight, possesses a temperament wholly unlike that of its daylight self. The city sheds its bustle and assumes a hush that feels conspiratorial, as though its cobblestones and chimneys whisper old truths only when mortal voices have fallen silent. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street under such a mantle, footsteps softened by thin rain that traced silvery lines across the pavement. Inside, the lamps burned low. Mrs. Hudson had long since retired, and the stirrings of the house felt distant, ghost-like. Holmes removed his coat with deliberate slowness, as if reluctant to disrupt the fragile quiet. He placed the fragment of the erased crest upon the table beside the charred parchment and the blood-stained tile, completing a grim trinity of secrets. His eyes swept across them with an intensity that suggested he no longer saw mere objects, but the outline of a figure whose shape grew sharper with every revelation. "Watson," he said at length, "we are no longer hunting a man who hides behind silence. We are hunting one who governs it." He lowered himself into his chair, steepling his long fingers. The fire crackled faintly in the grate, shedding enough warmth to soften the shadows without dispelling them entirely. I took my place opposite, waiting for the torrent of deductions I sensed brewing. Instead, Holmes remained silent. Minutes passed. The city murmured distantly, the roll of a late carriage, a shout in some far-off alley, but inside our rooms, time itself seemed to listen. At last, Holmes reached for the small wooden tile bearing the scraped sigil. "This," he murmured, "is the emblem of a fallen house. Stripped from public record, excised from heraldry, its memory suppressed with a thoroughness exceeding any ordinary scandal. Only families whose affairs touched matters of national sensitivity are afforded such erasure." "And the document?" I asked. "The one hidden in the Carpenter's secret recess. Could it be related to that house's downfall?" "Almost certainly," Holmes replied. "A document with power to alter inheritance, political alliances, perhaps even legitimacy of title. Something worth burning, but not entirely destroyed by a man who feared both its contents and its survival." He rose abruptly and crossed to the cabinet where he kept certain private correspondences and case notes. From its depths he extracted a thin, cloth-bound ledger, not one of ours, but the Carpenter's, retrieved earlier with the fragments from the workshop and left untouched until now. "It is time," he said, "to read the man the world denied a voice." He placed the ledger between us. Its binding was worn, its pages warped slightly by moisture absorbed over years of labor. Several entries were written in crude shorthand, others in a cipher Holmes had cracked days earlier. The earliest pages detailed mundane commissions, tables, desk repairs, carriage compartments. But as we moved deeper into the book, the entries shifted. "Here," Holmes said, pointing, "the first mention of a private client." The entry was sparse, initials only, CH beside it, a sum unusually high for craftsmanship. No description of the requested piece, only the phrase, "compartment to endure fire." Holmes's brow furrowed. Not merely a hiding place, an ark against destruction, a container for something whose survival was paramount. The next pages bore similar commissions, each more complex, until we reached a passage half erased by smudged strokes, as though the Carpenter had attempted to blot out his own recollection. Holmes strained to decipher the faint words. He returned, spoke of a cabinet greater than any before, asked that I protect something even from him. My pulse quickened. Protect from him? What could that mean? Holmes's jaw tightened. It means CH feared what he carried. It means the Carpenter became custodian of a secret too dangerous to entrust even to its owner. Lightning flickered distantly, though no thunder followed. London's sky had become a sheet of dull metal. Holmes turned the page. The next entry chilled me to the core. Refused commission, he threatened Mrs. H. left with rage. I hid the prototype. More danger in silence than in speech. Mrs. H., the widow. Holmes closed the ledger halfway. Do you perceive, Watson, the shift in the Carpenter's intent? He began merely as a craftsman, but at this point he became adjudicator of a moral dilemma, choosing not to build what a powerful man desired. And so, I whispered, he died. Holmes nodded, his face grim. He reopened the ledger to the final pages. These were hurried, cramped, written by a hand that trembled. If I finish it, he wins. If I refuse, he kills. I must carve only truth. The boy knows. God protect him. Holmes shut the ledger. The boy, he said softly, was not ignorant. He was entrusted, or perhaps he observed more than either of them realized. He rose and paced, his silhouette flickering against the firelight. Which brings us to the final piece. Something incomplete, Watson. Not by neglect, but by intention. He retrieved the panel fragment we had seen at the auction, the one we had nearly lost amid the distractions of Spencer's rooms. Consider, Holmes said, holding the carved wood beneath the lamplight, why a patron who feared secrecy would allow a piece of the prototype to enter public auction. To draw us out, I suggested. No, Holmes replied. To gauge our knowledge. He turned the fragment toward me. Someone wanted to see whether we recognized its significance. We did, and so the gentleman departed in haste. Not to flee, but to report. The implication sent a chill down my spine. Holmes continued. The true patron remains unseen, but his reach is long, his influence subtle, and his fear profound. Such a man does not act alone. He moves pawns to shield himself. He paused. And yet, his voice dropped to a whisper. Even the most powerful man must record his sins somewhere. He moved to his escritoire and retrieved a folded sheet. It arrived while we were at the auction, he said, handing it to me. I unfolded it. The words inside were written in the same terse hand as before. The ledger is incomplete. One page missing. Midnight will reveal what daylight conceals. I looked up sharply. What does it mean? Holmes extinguished all but one lamp, plunging the room into deep shadow. It means, he said, that the document we hold is not the only ledger in this case. He struck a match, revealing a faint shimmer upon the ledger's last page, a sheen invisible under full lamplight. My breath caught. A pattern emerged, a thin, waxy residue forming a faint square. Holmes took a blade and slid it beneath the page's corner. The page lifted, revealing a hollow within the ledger's binding. Inside lay a folded sheet, no larger than a calling card, written in the carpenter's cramped, urgent hand. Holmes read it aloud. He is not C.H. His master stands above him. The cabinet was for the master, not the man. Beware the one who never speaks, yet is always obeyed. A silence fell so deep I could hear the tick of the mantel clock as though it struck through fog. Holmes lowered the paper. Watson, he said, his voice grave, we no longer face a single patron. We face a chain of command, and at its summit. His gaze moved to the window, where only blackness peered back. Stands a man whose identity we must now uncover. The fire hissed softly. Midnight settled fully upon Baker Street, and the case, which had seemed labyrinth enough, had revealed yet another corridor, a path leading upward toward a figure who had used others not to conceal a truth, but to guard his own authority. Holmes set the ledger aside with reverence, as though it were the carpenter's final whisper. Prepare yourself, Watson, he said quietly. The next step brings us into the lightless chambers of power. Dawn crept upon London like a reluctant confession, its pale light filtering through the soot-stained curtains of Baker Street with the sickly hesitancy of a truth half-spoken. I slept little that night, troubled by the revelation of the hidden page, the shattered prototype in the perished chest, and the grim message implying that the architect of our labyrinth lurked higher than the erased crest, higher than the trembling solicitor, higher even than the commanding gentleman who had served as courier at the auction. Holmes, despite his habitual detachment, did not sleep at all. I found him at the window in the grey hour before sunrise, his silhouette framed against the thinning mist, his pipe unlit in his hand. Watson, he said without turning, the time has come to confront the master behind the man. I joined him at the window. The street stirred faintly. Milk cart rattling past, a newsboy setting out early, but the world seemed suspended still, as though waiting upon our next step. Holmes spoke again, voice low, almost reflective. "The carpenter knew of this master," he murmured. "He wrote of him with fear, not the fear of violence, that he had already suffered, but the fear of failing him. A man of great influence may rely on loyal servants, but one who inspires dread achieves silence deeper than loyalty." He finally lit his pipe, only to abandon it moments later. "We must revisit the widow," he said. "Not to question her about her husband's death, she cannot bear that, but to understand the life he lived beside her. She may hold the last thread." The walk to the carpenter's modest lodgings was quiet, save for the clatter of early trade carts. The widow received us in a sitting room whose poor furnishings bore the unmistakable weight of honest living. Patched curtain hems, mended table legs, a small embroidered sampler bearing the initials of a devoted but sorrowful woman. Her mourning veil was lifted now, revealing a face whose grief etched itself not in tears, but in the hardening stillness about the mouth. "I know why you have come," she said, before Holmes could speak. "The boy. You wished to know what he meant to my husband." Her voice trembled at the final word, but she steadied it with resolve. Holmes bowed with the respectful gravity he reserved for those whose pain he dared not disturb. "Not only the boy," he said gently. "We seek the one your husband feared, the one he wrote of." She stiffened, clutching her shawl. "I cannot speak of him." "You must," Holmes replied softly, "for your husband died protecting something, and until we know it, his silence cannot rest." The widow closed her eyes. "Very well," she whispered, "but you will not name him. You will not speak his name, even in your thoughts. Promise me." Holmes inclined his head. "You have my word." She sank into her chair, hands twisting in her lap. "Years ago, my husband worked for a man of great rank. A man people obeyed not because they respected him, but because they feared him. He was not unkind. No, that was the danger. His kindness was a weapon. He believed himself a shepherd of lesser souls. He said my husband's gift could serve a higher purpose." "And the commission?" Holmes asked. "He demanded a cabinet that could hold a document others must never see. A document which, if revealed, would destroy not him, but those beneath him. My husband refused when he learned what it concerned. The master was furious. Their quarrel ended with my husband fleeing to London." Her gaze hardened. But powerful men do not forget. Holmes's fingers tightened upon the arm of his chair. "And the apprentice? He learned too much," she whispered. "My husband tried to send him away, but the boy returned after the death. He searched the workshop. He found something." She broke off abruptly, covering her mouth. Holmes knelt beside her. "What did he find?" "A letter," she breathed, "addressed to my husband, containing only one line. 'Finish what you began, or others will finish you.' It bore no signature, yet he knew instantly from whom it came." Her voice dissolved. Holmes rose, his expression carved from shadow. When he spoke, it was with a gravity I seldom heard from him. "The master," he said, "stands revealed not by his name, but by his methods. Watson, we must return to the workshop." The widow clutched her shawl tighter. "Please," she whispered, "do not confront him. He has the law in his pocket, the papers in his chambers, and the hearts of men in his hand." Holmes bowed. "We seek truth only." As we left, I saw her sink back into her chair as though drained of breath, yet relieved of a burden she had carried too long. The workshop awaited us with its grim quiet, the air stagnant as though mourning. Holmes locked the door behind us, struck a match, and lit the lantern. The light fell across the beams in trembling waves. Holmes moved swiftly to the concealed floor compartment we had discovered earlier. "He removed something, Watson," he said, lens in hand. "But men, who hide in shadows forget that shadows also record. He brushed the hollow with a cloth. Another faint smear of varnish appeared, newer than the workshop's general disuse. He varnished something before killing the boy, Holmes murmured. Something small, something portable. A letter? I said. A letter, yes, but more than that. He examined the compartment's lip. A fragment of the original seal was caught here, dried, cracked, not the erased crest, but the crest beneath it. My breath caught. A false seal! Not false, Holmes said, but separate. There were 2 houses involved. One erased, one hidden. He straightened. Watson, we must trace the missing page of the Carpenter's ledger. The hollow concealed something more than a letter. We searched the workshop with methodical care. Crevices, rafters, drawers, beneath discarded cloths, inside unfinished furniture. At length, Holmes paused beside the beam from which the apprentice had hung, staring upward. He took my walking stick, prodded a joint in the timber, and a splintered piece of wood fell to the floor. Inside it lay a tiny roll of paper. Holmes unrolled it. The message, written in the carpenter's careful hand, read, "He serves another. Do not trust the crest. The master of the man is the man who never signs." Holmes's face changed, not in shock nor triumph, but in cold realization. "The unseen," he whispered. "The advisor behind the advisor, the man who drafts letters others sign, the man who writes laws others claim, the ghost in every chamber of Parliament." He turned to me, eyes blazing with a fierce lucidity. "Watson, the true patron is not noble by birth, but by influence. A man whose name is absent from scandal because he ensures others bear the blame. A man whose power is silence." "Then we cannot reach him," I murmured. Holmes held up the roll of paper. "We can." He knelt beside the workbench, retrieving the chalk that had once traced enigmatic symbols beneath the dying carpenter's body. He sketched the geometry we had seen in the prototype, the interlocking compartments, the shifting layers that concealed the truth within truth. "The carpenter left us more than clues," Holmes said. "He left a map, not of wood, but of motive. The lines formed a pattern only Holmes could fully decipher. This," he said, "is the design of a political machine. Each compartment hides another, each man conceals his superior, until only one remains who hides from all." "And his name?" I asked. Holmes's voice fell to a whisper. "He has no name in this ledger. That is how he survives." We gathered everything, the ledger, the fragments, the messages, and returned to Baker Street. There, Holmes wrote a confidential report, sealed it, and handed it to me. "Deliver this to the one man in government who has ever opposed the unseen patron," he said. "He will know what to do." "And you?" I asked. Holmes looked toward the door, lips pressed in determination. "I," he said, "must visit the man who signs nothing." Before I could object, he placed a hand upon my shoulder. "Fear not, Watson. This is a man who kills only through others." He paused, eyes shadowed. "Usually." He donned his coat and left without further word. I never learned what transpired in that hour. Holmes returned pale, silent but alive. He burned a folded sheet in the fireplace without showing it to me. The next morning, newspapers whispered of a resignation in Parliament, quiet, abrupt, and unexplained. No names were printed. No scandal surfaced. Yet Holmes, gazing at the flames, murmured, "The grain remembers blood, even when the hands do not." He turned away from the fire. And so should we. The case of the silent carpenter ended not with triumph, but with the faintest exhale of justice, unseen, unspoken, and yet unmistakably present. London moved on, but I never again passed a joiner's shop without feeling that secrets, once carved, never quite leave the wood.